Hi, everyone. Welcome to the... Well, let me start that again. 3, 2, 1. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm very pleased to welcome back my friend Michael Shellenberger for his third appearance on the Power Hungry Podcast. Michael, welcome back.
Great to be back, Robert.
So much has happened since you were last on. I think it was May of 2021. You've run for governor, Diablo Canyon, Ukraine. There's a ton of things to talk about. So let's get going. But first, yesterday, I got to tell you, I was happy. I can't imagine how happy you were to see that the California legislature passed a bill that extends the life of Diablo Canyon until 2030. It's not long enough, but tell me, I mean, tell me how you feel. The typical journalist question to how does this feel?
So good that I have been trying to not completely experience it all at once so I can make it last longer. I always believed we were going to save it. And I bet, Robert, and I have you as my witness, because I think you can testify that I always had faith in it. I'm not sure if you always did. Or I think very few. My wife did not. I think it's fair to say, not many people thought we could save Diablo Canyon. Not many true believers.
I was very skeptical. I just thought that the green law, I'm not going to call them green anymore. The NGOs I'm not calling them environmental groups anymore. They're NGOs. I thought they just have so much sway, and that this was something that was just a fait accompli. But I mean, was this? Tell me why it happened. I mean, in your view, I mean, there are a lot of factors here. The heat wave that was hitting it at the same time that the vote happens. Clear problems with reliability, blackouts. Yeah. I mean, there are many factors. Is there one that's more important than another? Tell me how you see why did the tide change and why now?
Well, look, I mean, obviously. The overriding factor was we're on the cusp of blackouts again, third year in a row, Robert. I mean, this is a very serious situation. To get a sense of it, August 24th, the state announced that it was going to ban all internal combustion vehicles in 2035. 6 days later, the state warned people not to charge their electric vehicles because there wasn't enough electricity. Yeah. This is in the fifth largest economy of the world, an economy that has been a leader on renewables, that considers itself a model for the rest of the United States, indeed is the model for the Democrats for how to do energy policy around the rest of the United States. We're having to, we're struggling to keep the lights on. We have to beg people to stop using electricity. So clearly, that was a huge part of it. I mean, Gavin himself said when he announced that he was looking at this earlier this year, he said that the 2020 blackouts were a key moment. I was the only journalist, and there were others on the conference call, to actually quote the head of the grid. I wrote a Forbes column on it, saying that it was fundamentally about lack of supply, and B, that it was because they had lost San Onofre nuclear plant in 2013. Right. Nobody else reported it. The state is full of fake journalists, I have to say. It's pathetic, who do not properly report on this issue. You report on it properly, but of course you don't live here. You're in Texas. So that is by far and away just the main issue. Now, it
was fundamentally about reliability, and I thought it was
fundamentally about reliability.
And it was remarkable. I thought Elliot Mainzer, the CEO of CAISO, on the day of the vote, sent a letter to the governor saying, we don't have a replacement. I mean, effectively, I'm paraphrasing here, and I cited it in my Forbes piece yesterday, but effectively saying, we don't have a replacement here. And so this is, if you want reliable electricity, we need this plant. And it was as plain, and it was in that bureaucratic language, but I thought it was I think that letter was really important. And one of the most plain, for all the bureaucratese in it, the message was very clear.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I think that was absolutely fundamental. I mean, I got a tip yesterday and I tweeted it out, but they're firing back up a kerosene jet fuel powered power plant in Oakland that is considered one of the worst power plants in the state. It's environmental injustice. It's in, of course, a poor black and brown neighborhood in Oakland. It's totally disgusting and dirty. They announced to great fanfare in 2019 that they were going to replace it with batteries.
Right.
And they announced that they were going to keep operating it. So clearest reliability issue. Now, I will say, I think that, our advocacy for Diablo also played a role here because,
Sure.
we've seen um, they could just burn more diesel. I mean, in other words, you just kind of go, uh, or more gas. I mean, it's not inconceivable that you could just drop some more natural gas power plants into California before then, or pull more, or get more contracts, or have them in Nevada or somewhere.
Right. And
It's
they've
not
built more,
inconceivable
and
they
they
could do that,
and
and they
new
have.
gas plants have
Yeah,
been built, and just in the
yeah,
last
they
few
have.
months. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not inconceivable they could do more of that to try to replace Diablo. We certainly have seen Germany, which needs all of its nuclear plants, resisting to the final moment to make a decision on whether or not to keep its three plants open. Apparently now they're just going to sacrifice one to the gods and then keep the other two alive. That's
Is
the
that the
latest
latest? Because
week.
it's been
It's the
going back and
latest.
forth and back
It's,
and forth.
yeah,
And first, oh, we're going to save all
unbelievable.
three, and then we don't.
Yeah,
The gas isn't really that important,
yeah,
and then just before we logged on, Gazprom announced that Nord Stream is being shut down indefinitely. Right? They've been
yeah, of course.
toying with Germany for a while. Now they're saying it's indefinite. Yeah, well, that's Germany, but I just felt that California was going to follow that German model off the cliff because of some. I don't know. I want to come back to this narcissistic nihilism that line that you've been using. But but tell me, I mean, this is a win for rationality, isn't it? I mean, it's just a win for energy
Yeah.
realism above all. Is that's how I see it? How do you see it?
Well, yeah, I think it is, but of course we've seen a lot of irrationality too, and I also think it's a win for politics. I mean, I think that Gavin, it shows the importance of politics. I think Gavin is going to run for president, wants to run for president, does not want blackouts on his record. You know, we have changed public attitudes on nuclear in California. It's a plurality of support for keeping the plant open. I'll take some credit for it. I think my TED Talks and our advocacy have made a big difference in terms of some of the coverage. I was basically blacklisted from most mainstream news reporting for the last 6 years, Robert. I mean, I had some attention for my advocacy in 2016, but for the most part, I was persona non grata in the mainstream news media. Well, just in the last, few weeks, I've been quoted in the Washington Post, National Public Radio. CNN is actually flying me to Portugal later this month to give a pitch on nuclear. This is I was just interviewed by Chris Cuomo yesterday. It was his own podcast, and he's changing his mind about nuclear, even though you may know his father shut down Shoreham nuclear plant, and his brother, of course, shut down Indian Point, which we talked about.
Sure.
So clearly something's happening. I mean, I just tweeted, my latest favorite tweet was some young person, because to put it in context, in 2016, as you remember, you'd go online on Twitter and you'd say something nice about nuclear and people accuse you of being a shill for the industry, or they
Yeah.
would say, oh, nuclear is carbon intensive. Today, a young person, I assume it's a young person, seems like it, they tweeted the fact that basically the entire world is in an energy crisis because a small group of people decided to be woke about nuclear energy is mind-numbing.
Well,
I
that's
love
interesting.
that.
Let's talk about that a little bit because it's something we've talked about. I think, and I've noticed, and you had a hand in nurturing some of these people. But there is a different generation now, and I think I'm 62 this year, so I'm an older, I'm a boomer. But there's a different cadre, I'll use that word, of younger people in I don't know, I forget, Gen X, but 20 and 30 somethings, that they have a different attitude toward nuclear, and that really gives me hope in looking at the future about where this is going, because they're bringing fresh energy and a fresh perspective to it that I think is much needed. So, Matty Hilly, Mark Nelson, Emmett Penny, other people that have been out front on this and have really, I think, have to help change the public discourse on this. Is that do you see it the same way? I mean, all these people, they're your friends.
Well, I hired them all.
Yeah, right.
I trained them. I mean, these they're totally inspirations to me, and they make me feel much more comfortable to be able to work on other things now, knowing that the movement is in the hands of very strong leaders. I mean, what I did when I started Environmental Progress in 2016 and started the pro-nuclear movement was to basically de-snobify it. I mean, you have to remember that before 2016, all pro-nuclear advocacy was elitist. It was openly snobby. It was openly, celebrating nuclear reactors that didn't exist. People that were pro-nuclear tended to look down on ordinary people. I very early on established an ethos that we were going to make the movement open to pro-nuclear people of all points of view, including climate skeptics, which was, of course, very controversial for the left-wing pro-nuclear people who wanted to exclude climate skeptics from the movement. I also said, look, you can be a climate alarmist, you can be a climate skeptic, you can be more lukewarm like me on climate change, but what matters is that you're pro-nuclear. There's people in the pro-nuclear movement that I don't particularly like, that don't like me, and that's okay. That's what it means to have a movement. It's not a social club. It's not, this is not the Harvard Club. This is a movement, and that movement is real. It exists. It's separate from me. It has people in it that I don't know. It has people in it that I didn't hire. You see the Wall Street Journal today ran a huge piece about Chris Kiefer, the medical doctor in Canada,
Sure.
Zion Lights, who did briefly work for us, but then started her own group. Maddie Hilley has her own group, Campaign for a Green Nuclear Deal. Emmett Penny is writing a daily electrical and energy Substack that is actually a must-read for people that follow energy.
That's
Mark Nelson
gridbrief.com. Yeah.
Outstanding publication. Mark Nelson is running Radiant Energy Fund and supporting Stand Up for Nuclear, pro-nuclear protests around the world. So look, it's an actual social movement. And frankly, its leadership is a heck of a lot younger, a lot more intelligent, a lot better looking than the anti-nuclear movement.
You beat me to the punch on that one. Well, let's talk about Europe for a minute, because I think it seems to me the other big picture part of this, the change on Diablo Canyon, is the European energy crisis, and it's only getting worse. The announcement that Nord Stream is going to be shut down indefinitely, of flows of gas out of Russia into Germany. But we've been talking about what's happening in the U.S., and of course, Mark and others have been active in Europe, but what I see in Europe is a whole other kind of genesis of more pro-nuclear movement because of the soaring price of natural gas. So you've seen Last Energy, a U.S. company, announced 10 SMRs potentially in Poland. The Brits are announcing, they're pushing Rolls-Royce for SMRs. So what's the lay of, you were in Europe recently. Tell me about your experience there and how you see nuclear in Europe today, given the ongoing crisis.
Totally back. I mean, and it's not only back, it's very mainstream. You still have the European Commission, which is in this love affair with renewables because it's overwhelmingly dominated by Germany. But I was in Sweden last fall. Nuclear is back there. Britain, nuclear was back strongly last fall. You saw Macron last fall came out strong for nuclear. Netherlands came out for nuclear as well. So it's a huge change, it's worldwide. It's Japan, it's South Korea, everybody's going nuclear. As you know, I'm very skeptical that the smaller reactors will ever work. I think they're just going to do big reactors. That's what they know how to build. We've had a wobble in France because, of course, the French have been trying to go from 70 to 80% nuclear to 50% nuclear. Well, in the process, they basically demonized nuclear. They drove some of their best people out of the company EDF, Electricité de France, and demoralized the nuclear folks. So then they discover in routine inspections, but ones that should have been detected years ago, that the welds on some of the pipes needed to be re-welded. This is not, some catastrophic event, but it had to happen. So these plants are like half of the nuclear fleet in France is down for maintenance. Of course, the anti-nuclear folks are making a lot of hay of it. But unfortunately, President Macron of France came out and said, oh, this is the end of abundance, the energy crisis. And I did an interview with Le Point, which is an important publication in France that we know Macron reads. And so I said, well, what is it, the end of abundance because you guys needed to weld some pipes together? This is, these guys lapse into Malthusian, dystopian apocalyptic talk because of, routine maintenance issues. So that always plagues nuclear. Nuclear is a technology that people catastrophize about. That is
Right.
the go-to mode with it. A nuclear plant, I mean, sorry, a natural gas pipeline can explode and kill a dozen people, but nobody's like, oh gosh, it raises existential questions around the sustainability of Western civilization. They go, you better check your pipelines, you
Yeah.
know. So nuclear is obviously the site of so much existential angst, which of course is what makes it so interesting and why I'm writing a book about it. But I do think nuclear is something where, look, full employment for pro-nuclear advocates for centuries to come, because we have our work cut out for us. But I do think, looking back in the 6 years since we started the pro-nuclear movement, that there is a good ethos. It's an ethos of inclusivity. It's populist, anti-elitist. It's got very strong young leaders who are going to be, who are in their late 20s, early 30s, who are going to be strong leaders for decades to come. So I do think I'm very optimistic about the pro-nuclear movement. Of course, as you know, these plants take a super long time to build. So nuclear, it's going to be gas, not nuclear. It's going to be gas and coal,
Right.
not nuclear, that comes to the rescue of Europe.
Yeah, and that's going to be for a while. But I wanted to just bring up one quick point where you talked about this catastrophism, and was interesting to me. NPR dutifully quoted after the vote. They quoted this woman, Juliet Christian Smith from the Union of Concerned Scientists, who claimed that the earthquake-induced accident at Diablo Canyon could more than $100 billion in damage and 10,000 cancer deaths. And that this, by passing the bill, the legislature ignores the plant's environmental impacts and vulnerability to earthquakes. Safety cannot take a backseat in our quest to, here are the keywords, keep the lights on and reduce global warming emissions. I mean, to me, that was just remarkable that the fear mongering continues even after these groups got a well-deserved spanking. And I got to tell you, Michael, I enjoyed that so much to see NRDC, Union of Concerned Scientists, Friends of the Earth, all get not just, it wasn't a close vote in the assembly, but they just continue the same narrative even after they lose with, oh, well, this is the catastrophism. But you've written a whole book about this apocalypticism. And is that inevitably going to be always tied to nuclear? Or is there a way to move past this irrational fear of radiation?
Oh, big question. That's the right question. So it's a big question. Let's unpack it. I mean, I've been, as you know, Apocalypse Never, where it goes is it says this is a religion.
Yeah.
It's a religion that, and you can see it very dramatically in Germany. You kind of go, why does Greta Thunberg and Greenpeace, why would they opt for coal and oil burning over nuclear? Because nuclear is the devil. It's a secular devil. It's demonic. Coal might be polluting, but nuclear is satanic. That's basically the way it works in the mentality.
And why? And why is that? Because it's the pinnacle of technology. Is that where that we've bitten from the tree of the apple of knowledge, and that this is the ultimate example of that? I mean, there's some very clear Christian overlap here that we've talked about in terms of ideas about sin and salvation.
That's got to be part of it, right? I mean, that and the extraordinary power it brings. I think there's another part of it. I wrote this piece for Forbes a few years ago called "The Real Reason They Hate Nuclear is Because It Means We Don't Need Renewables."
Right. Yeah.
So the problem with nuclear is that it solves too many problems. So you can't catastrophize about the end of the world if you have nuclear.
Because we're not going to run out of everything, right?
Yeah, I mean, what role, like Greta Thunberg, there's no point in being lectured by an adolescent, by a spoiled schoolgirl if you just do what France did. So if you want to be lectured by an adolescent schoolgirl, which Europe clearly does, that's why they keep promoting her, then nuclear is the threat. Now, am I saying that people think consciously that way? No, these things kind of emerge, organically and unconsciously. So that means that I think that we're seeing there is something in the West, and I do think it's in the West, by the way. We don't, like Japan and South Korea, they don't have like a nature guilt. They have more like ancestor guilt, which fits more their spiritual traditions. They have an ancestor worship in those places. They feel guilt. They're worried about, their fear is bringing shame onto their family. and shame onto their community. In the West, it's guilt around what we've done to nature and then the disaster that's coming. And as you said, that's obviously just a kind of restatement of the Judeo-Christian myth. So yeah, you get into the late 19th century, early 20th century, and people in Europe stop believing in God. They stop believing in traditional religions. A new story emerges. People say it's an atheist story, but atheism is still a belief system.
Yeah.
Science, the scientific story is still a belief system. And that story says you're just an animal. You eat, reproduce, and die. That's it. There's no meaning to your life. Your life is meaningless. That's the story that really gets told, and it really gets taught to baby boomers in particular after World War II. This is all really well told by in the biography of the Unabomber. He describes how Harvard and other elite institutions start telling the story, and they start saying, well, ethics is subjective and morality is subjective, so all we know is science, and so they just tell the story. But that story is so depressing that it creates this crisis of nihilism. Nihilism just means the idea that sort of the world is meaningless and there's sort of, there's no purpose to life. The answer, of course, to nihilism is that there is a purpose and meaning to life. It's to love your family. It's to love your community. It's to make the world a better place for the people that come after us. There's all sorts of stories we can tell. So you do have a nihilism that emerges, and then you get this alternative religion that's really, I think, fascinating. The greatest threat to civilization is obviously not coming from either lack of natural resources or from the technology. The threat to civilization is coming from within ourselves. It's coming from the neuroticism, the nihilism, and the narcissism. And you see all of them swept up into Greta Thunberg and Extinction Rebellion, a sort of simultaneous kind of a desperate and sad, fear-mongering.
Dystopianism, right?
Dystopianism. We know it's actually depressing.
We've created this mess, and so it's a secular religion around our own sin here on earth against nature, and we have to atone.
That's right. That's right.
And I see
so
it
it's fear mongering in service also of power. So the desire for power and meaning are kind of tied up together here, where Greta Thunberg gets power. Extinction Rebellion activists, they get a sense of social power. They go on the media, they get to testify, they raise money,
right.
They feel famous, and they get a sense of purpose and meaning from that by depressing everybody else and depressing our kids. So obviously the traditional solution from the political right has been, well, we need to affirm markets. That's too thin of a story to compete against that. The right story, you get a little closer. Just to plug a new book that's very good. I blurbed it. Marion Tupy and Gail Pooley's new book, Superabundance. You probably blurbed it too, or at least you'll probably have them on.
No, I know about the book, and I wanted to have Marion on for a long time. But yeah, I've seen that book, and we should talk about Peter Zion's new book as well. Because
oh my gosh, let's get into it. But anyway, so that's the story. But my view, which is that we need to have a much more inspiring story than that. It's a story of lifting everybody out of poverty. It's a story of reducing humankind's environmental footprint to close to zero, natural gas to nuclear, which is something you've been a big evangelist for. I'm increasingly coming to a view, and we can argue about it a little bit because I think you're more skeptical than me, but that we do need a vision of getting to hydrogen. Been spending more time with we have a common, you and I are like the children of Jesse Ossoff, I was just with our mentor. I was just with Dad, and we were talking about hydrogen.
I love Jesse, and I am skeptical about hydrogen because it's a very small molecule, and I just don't see many fuel cells around. But let me jump back before we go to hydrogen.
Well, we got to get there, but I think that vision is important to share with people.
Yeah.
It's a vision of environmental progress rather than a vision of environmental decline, and it's also different than the traditional, I think, conservative or libertarian story, which has just been a story of freedom, markets. I don't think that's I don't think it's competitive or purpose driven enough for the spiritual
I,
needs that modern people
I
have.
like that. I like the way you're couching that. I would read it back to you a little in this way. I'd say we need a more pro-human, pro-energy, pro-nature view, right? Then
Yes.
and markets aren't going to be enough, and we need government involvement, particularly when it comes to nuclear. And this is one of the things that I'm
Yes.
exploring in the documentary that I'm working on. We've talked to you about it already, but that these markets aren't going to be enough to foster new nuclear. We're going to have a stronger governmental hand throughout the chain, right? Whether it's the mining, the processing, the decommissioning, it needs more robust government or intervention or involvement, I guess would be the better word. Why skepticism on SMRs? I think I understand where you're coming from, but walk me through, your greater enthalpic efficiency, greater material efficiency of having a bigger power plant, right? That's
Yeah.
been known since Edison,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
The bigger your power plant, the more efficient the system is because
Yes.
just fewer machines and you get better capital efficiency, et cetera. But there are a lot of SMR technologies that are being developed. Some of them are, paper reactors. NuScale got approval for construction of their modular reactor SMR in Idaho Falls at Idaho National Lab. Now, there are other SMRs appear to be promising. So tell me why you're skeptical and what is the right size? Is it 300 megawatts or above, or where's that threshold that you go from SMR to actually a size that you think is viable for the long term?
Yeah, like I think if we're in a heavy nuclear world, there will be nuclear reactors of different types, but we're in a very low nuclear world right now. And so I think that when you look at governments, when they make decisions around what kind of nuclear to go with, they go with big standard designs. That's
Right.
what the Dutch government's going to do. I was just with the guy in the Netherlands who will basically make the decision. And he said they're just looking at it's basically between the Koreans and the French at this point.
Oh, between
And it's for
The Korean design and the European pressurized reactor, the EPR, is
yeah.
that right? Yeah.
I mean,
So
not
we're
just
talking
the,
we're talking
not
a
just
gig
the des-
we're talking a gigawatt
yeah,
scale, gigawatt size
yeah,
reactors. Yeah. Okay.
yeah, not just the design, but obviously the construction crews as well. They just all go together. So,
Yeah.
and even sometimes the financing. But yeah, and look, we've had small modular reactors. They're aircraft carriers, they're submarines, they're icebreakers in Russia. So there's a possibility for it. I'm not going to go out there and say you shouldn't do it, but I get concerned because here we put a bunch of blood, sweat, and tears into AP1000s in the United States. We built them in Vogel, and then we're walking away from it. The workers are to the wind. I mean, they trained so many welders to do nuclear grade welds, and now it's all lost. I think the United States needs a nuclear building program to build AP1000s. If we don't want to do AP1000s, then we should partner with the Koreans or the French to build large nuclear plants here, export our gas abroad, expand LNG export terminals significantly. It takes, basically 5 years, including permitting and construction, to build a new LNG terminal to export. We should be exporting gas all around the world. It's our obligation, honestly, and Europe needs it. And people always say, "Oh, it takes too long." It's funny. Someone, by the way, posted a video of a Brit in 2011 saying, "There's no point in doing nuclear plants because it would take until 2020 and to have nuclear plants online."
Right.
So you got to, best time to start building was yesterday. Second best time is today. So we should be doing these things, in my view. But small, I just go, yeah, it's guaranteed to be more expensive.
Yeah.
There's always been a lot of fascinating designs. I can appreciate as the nuclear enthusiast in me, I can appreciate the designs. I think if I trust anybody to do it, it'd be the Japanese, because they're the ones that finally got nuclear plant building down so fast, and they have a Hitachi small modular reactor that does seem more promising. But I just kind of go, it's not the main event. It's not the
Okay.
it's an amuse bouche. Maybe it's not the entree.
Good. Okay. I like that. Well, then where would you house it then? I mean, because this is one of the other complications in the U.S. grid, right? We have a very diffused ownership system, right? 3,000 different providers between the investor-owned utilities, the co-ops, publicly owned utilities. So if you're going to have the government do this, are you going to house it at the DOE? Are you proposing a new agency that would be in charge of this? And how does that work? I mean, is this essentially because what I'm hearing you say is, I'm thinking in my head, Well, you're proposing a federal agency that's going to Bigfoot a lot of utilities around the country, and that's going to be a difficult political fight. And I'm not arguing with where your point, but I'm just trying to think ahead about how does that manifest itself? What is it going to look like?
Well, I think as context, it's worth pointing out, first of all, that the government has basically taken over electricity production in the United States. These heavy renewable subsidies that they just expanded under IRA are so big that they're going to, if assuming they continue, they're going to bankrupt all other forms of generation, and it means that everything's going to end up having to be subsidized. So that's what's already happening with natural gas plants in many markets. They have to be subsidized on capacity markets in order to keep operating. So you basically had a government takeover of electrical generation in the United States, and that's the reality.
So let me stop you there because I haven't thought of it. I haven't thought of it in those terms. But I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act, Manchin Schumer, it adds 120 billion in subsidies for wind and solar. It's a $250 billion, $240 billion between now and 2031. So those are massive subsidies. But I hadn't. I mean, don't mean to be impolite in interrupting so much, but you're saying this amounts to, in your view, a government takeover then of the utility sector because the subsidies are so lavish?
It's going to result in that. I mean, if those subsidies. Now, the other thing is, I think the question is how much of those renewables can they do given the transmission constraints?
Right.
What our friend Roger Pilkey calls the friction, the real world friction. But nonetheless, I do think there's a heavy amount of government control in general over electricity, energy. We've seen oil and gas production being throttled by the Biden administration because it refuses to permit drilling. They refuse to permit the pipelines. They refuse to permit the LNG facilities that we need. So I think that's some context. Yeah. I think the other issue is that we have a history of this, which is that in the 50s and 60s, Eisenhower. Really starting in the 50s, Eisenhower and the DOE, because we don't like to have state-owned companies in the United States, but we do have national champions, and we chose two national champions, General Electric and Westinghouse, and they used those guys to go and promote nuclear among utilities in the United States and around the world. And so you had two designs, the pressurized water reactor and the boiling water reactor that went through different generations. If I were the nuclear czar working for a president of the United States, I would probably try to do something similar. You'd have two different national champions. I mean, you could do one, but it seems like you have two because you always need a hedge. And one of them I would say would be a new company that the federal government would get behind that would be that would basically be Bechtel and Southern, taking the people that built the AP1000s in Vogel, Georgia, and then you'd have another state-owned, or not state-owned, but state-backed national champion that would be in the Hitachi, more in the Hitachi boiling water reactor line, like the ABWRs out of Japan. So you still continue with the PWR, ABWR. You have both full-sized. And it would be nuclear plants that would, again, it'd be state-owned. They would not be state-owned. They would be they'd be national champions. And you would then go and just, work through Congress and also the utilities to have a plan to take nuclear from today's, 19% of electricity to something like 50% over the next, 30 years. And you would just create the incentives to do it. I don't think you'd want to necessarily do full public ownership, but you would basically create subsidies, incentives, tax structure to make that happen so that you don't have a grid that is super expensive, unreliable, like the kind of grid that we have now, but you're also building nuclear plants at home so that you can build them abroad and we can compete with Russia and China to provide nuclear power plants. And we manage
that supply chain internally, including mining more uranium. Well, I like the way you outlined it because I think that makes sense to me because I think it's exactly right. We're going to have some kind of a national champion if we're going to deploy nuclear at scale. The one thing, and maybe you saw this, but it was just last month that Dow Chemical announced that they were planning to build an SMR on the U.S. Gulf Coast using X Energy's design, which I think is interesting because it's an industrial company making this move, right? And looking at the price of natural gas and saying, well, we see this as, I read it as them saying, we see this as a hedge for against higher natural gas prices, which look like they're going to be around for a while. And we're going to use it for electricity production and process heat. So to me, that's quite interesting because it's the first, as far as I know, industrial company saying we're going to embrace the SMR. So not arguing with you on your views on SMRs, but I think it's just worth pointing that out because to me, that's a very interesting development. So let's shift gears for a while because I think last time we talked about Apocalypse Never, and since then you've had SanFransicko come out. How did it do? Did it do better than Apocalypse Never? Tell me, I write books. I'm just curious, how did that compare in terms of sales, in terms of the reception? How do you compare those two? Because you produced two books in a remarkably short amount of time, and both of them were very popular. What was the reception, and how did it change your view of what books are about? How did it, what was the result of those two books, and how did you perceive it?
So just at a commercial level, both books were very successful commercially. Apocalypse Never was a bestseller. SanFransicko would have been a bestseller had it come out in the summer rather than the fall. Many other books have sold less and made the bestseller list, so it was a very successful book commercially. Though not quite as much as Apocalypse Never, which also had a big international sales. It's now been translated into, I think it's in now 17 countries.
17 languages?
17 languages in 17 countries, yeah.
Okay.
So a real thrill. I mean, I'm excited. One of my life's goals is to go to all the countries that it's been published in, which I haven't been able to do yet. So yeah, I mean, but then I think more at a social change level, at a political level, it had a big impact. I mean, it's still, I know that SanFransicko is read by elected officials, including, I'm not going to name names, but by some well-known elected officials around the country, including district attorneys, including mayors, including city councils. I'm advising a number of elected officials on how to deal with homelessness. I think it changed the conversation. I just think that the big issue has been that people, mostly people on the left, but a lot of people, including on the right, had just kind of convinced themselves that people that are living in tents on the street are just there because they can't afford the rent, and it has really nothing to do with mental illness or drug addiction. And I'm pointing out that really this is almost entirely about drug addiction and untreated mental illness, that people that can't afford the rent, they move into cheaper apartments. They don't go camp a tent on the street. That's just not something that people, that are in a sane state of mind do. We're in a terrible drug crisis. We're in a terrible psychiatric crisis in the United States. We don't have a mental health care system. I think that I also, it started at the end more. And I, as you mentioned, I ran for governor in part because I wanted to, really the main reason was I wanted to address this issue of homelessness in California, and the people that I thought would run, nobody was running that was willing to kind of run on this platform. And it went great, man. I mean, what can I say? It was actually super fun. It was not the drudgery that I had heard campaigning would be in terms of fundraising. We raised $1.5 million. We had just 3 months. That's an incredibly short period of time to do it. I had, this time I was able to afford political professionals, and we were really building a momentum. And then I think we just ran out of time. So we ended up coming in third place. We didn't make the runoff, which is very disappointing. But nonetheless, I'm real proud of the campaign because I think it did bring a lot of attention to the issue. And I think it just changed how people think of this. I think people now understand that when we talk about homelessness, we're fundamentally talking about a problem of addiction and mental illness. We certainly need more housing, but this is not fundamentally a housing problem.
How much money? Well, you mentioned $1.5 million. I know I'm in Austin, and one of the mayoral candidates here raised $1 million. If you'd had $5 million, was there a number you had in your head about how much? I talk to politicians all the time about how much money they had. Ran into a woman who's on the Provo, Utah City Council a few months ago, and she raised $90,000. I automatically, if I meet him, I say how much. It's like this reflexive question I ask. how much money would you have needed to make? Was there a number in your head rather that you wanted to have to get into that runoff?
Yeah, I had good reason to think that we were going to raise something between 5 and 10 million,
Which really
and
would have made
for
a huge difference.
we would have gotten in the runoff. I
Yeah.
mean, without a question about it. I mean, there's a lot of, I mean, politics is, there's obviously a lot of complexity in it, but I mean, there is a part of it that is about just spending money on advertising to
Yeah.
get to buy yourself into the runoff. And so I got into the race because I felt confident that we could raise $5 to $10 million. I was disappointed that we only got one to 1.5. Without going into a lot of the technical details, running as an independent was a big part of the problem because basically, if you run with a party, you can donate to the party and you don't have to put such a target on your back as the donor. And
Uh-huh.
that wasn't possible as an independent. You had to be much more exposed as a donor. And, affluent folks are not always comfortable with advertising their wealth and advertising their politics, particularly in this environment.
Right.
And suffice it to say, my political opponents will use various methods to keep people out of supporting candidates. So, but look, I mean, we were gratified by the amount of attention that we got. We at the very end there, I was on Joe Rogan a second time. The end there we got on Bill Maher, and then we just ran out of runway. The election was 4 days after I was on Bill Maher, and I think there was a sense in which we were gaining momentum, but we just ran out of time. So, yeah, I mean, but that's, if I run again, that would be one of the issues. Is if there looks like there's a chance for me to run again, we would just need to know that the money's there. Otherwise, there's really no point, and there's no point in asking people to support you if you don't think you can get to that number.
So it's all to be blunt about it. Then it's all about the money.
Yeah, I mean, it's not all about it. I mean, I don't. I think that it helps to have a good candidate, but I think
Yeah, of course.
I think if I had the money, I think I would be able to get there. Yeah,
So,
yeah.
but talk about. I'm just curious because I've known a lot of politicians. How long did it really hurt? I mean, how was the disappointment of not making the runoff? Because I mean, from here I'm thinking, well, could you possibly beat Newsom in one, face to face? That's a big challenge, right? Because of all the money
Yeah.
that was behind him. But I mean, is it still hurt? Did it take you a couple days? What was it like afterward?
Yeah. I had somebody ask me, somebody goes, "Did you cry?" Because I hear that politicians cry. And I was like, I did not cry. And I'm not, and I do cry about things. I cry actually, especially as you get older, you find yourself crying over like ridiculous crap. But I did not, I was disappointed. My wife Helen cried. Election night sucked because I had to go and give a concession. I had to concede and give a defeat speech in front of all my supporters at a bar in downtown San Francisco, and that was a terrible experience. Helen, who was not excited about me running, but was basically convinced by these mothers of homeless addicts who asked me to run. The night of the election night party, she met one of the moms, and her son came, and I think, and she's comfortable with me telling the story, but basically her son, who's in his early 30s and has been an opioid addict for over a decade, has a hunchback now. He's like literally looks like an old man, and he was at the bar. I had never met him before, but I write about him in the book in San Francisco. His name is Corey. The mom is Jackie Berlin, and Helen met them, and we left, and she cried, and she was angry, and just angry at the system that lets very sick people stay on the street in the name of compassion. I think for the first time felt like this is really fucked up. Like there's something actually sinister going on, that this is not just like, that I think, she always, she agreed with what I was saying and supported me doing it. But I think for her, it felt like finally that this was like important for the society to put an end to what's going on the streets of San Francisco.
And so for her
So
to feel it then was different than
yeah,
before, and to
I
feel
think
that
so.
that
It was
feel
more
that
like, okay, these moms want my husband to run for governor, and I don't think he can win, but who would I be to get in the way? I think that was what she said.
yeah.
I think after the election, I think she's like, I think she was like, if you want to run it again, I'm going to be fully supportive, because this is an absolute injustice. This is just obviously wrong what's going on. So yeah, and then I took the time I needed to lick my wounds. It wasn't I mean, I've had some hard times in my life. I've had some difficult times. I'll tell you something. I had a much darker period between 2016 and 2019 when I decided to write Apocalypse Never. The frustration, the loneliness, the sense of not getting the support that I needed to do something that I thought was really important, which was to save nuclear plants. That was a much darker time than after the election. After the election, I sat down and binge watched a TV series about a politician, by the way, in Sweden called Borgen. On Netflix, and I tweeted out a photo, or I posted an Instagram photo, just holding up my fingers for V sign, and it had a lot of very warm support. Like, nobody, I mean, there must have been some people, I probably blocked them, but they were, I mean, I think there were some people who were, like, yeah, yeah, you loser. But, most people were very, they thought it was a noble effort, and they were very supportive. So I think that was very nice. And it's kind of kept going. I mean, it's really, because you got to remember, Gavin announced he was probably going to keep Diablo open when I was running for governor. And so really since then, I mean, my life is now, I'm a much happier person than I was, 6 years ago, 6 years ago.
After leaving Breakthrough and in between starting Environmental Progress and that period was,
and now and really losing all my donors and not getting the support that I needed because I was criticizing renewables and I wasn't promoting small modular reactors, and frankly just being a good journalist, rather than a kind of a non-thinking promoter of nuclear. So yeah, I mean, I'm actually in a really good place. I'm at
so it
peace
was worth
with
so it was
the
worth
run,
it was worth it, and
sure.
and that you sound like you might do it again.
We might, I have the same view, which is that I'll do it again if there's nobody better to do it. In other words, if there's somebody else that wants to go through the pain in the ass of having to ask people for money and run for governor and govern, fine, and I'll volunteer my services. But if there's not, then yeah. And if there's not, and we think we can raise the money, then we'll probably do it again.
Right.
All else being equal.
Well, let me follow up on
I don't need it. You know what I mean? Like, I'm actually quite happy with my dogs and living in Berkeley Hills and writing my books, making money on my Substack finally.
Well, we'll come back to Substack. We'll talk about journalism for a minute, because I've been, I've never had a real job. I've been a reporter my whole career. And I used to think liberal media, oh, that's a fiction. But now that I've been doing this for more than 30 years, I look at the industry, and it's very different from when I started, of course. But I clearly see, and the amount of uninformed, particularly around energy and power, that the reporting that I see consistently from some of the biggest media outlets in the country, it's just terrible. I mean, it's just like, there's no questioning about numbers. Like, particularly after Manchin Schumer, oh, this bill is going to reduce CO2 emissions by 40%. The hell it will. You get your calculator out. Do the basic mathematics. You're just repeating what's in the Democrats' press release. Why are you doing this? The New York Times, Jason Bordoff at Columbia, they were reprinting the same thing. And I'm like, no, this is not right. Why are you doing this? So I'm ranting a little bit, but how do you've been on both sides of this, being reported on and doing reporting? And we talked about this a little bit the last time you were on the podcast, but how do you see media now? Is it getting, and this is a big question, but is it getting better? Are the big outlets getting worse? What do you see in terms of trends, particularly when it comes to energy, climate, and power?
Robert, can I just take a quick break and deal with somebody at my door?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back.
Yeah. I'm going to stop this here. So let me condense that question. So you've been on both sides of the media story. Now you consider yourself a journalist. We talked about that before. You've also been a politician. You've been on both sides of the media fence, so to speak. How do you see the media coverage of energy, climate, power? How is it getting better, getting worse? Give me a general kind of view on how you see that.
I mean, I would have said getting worse until about, until they started saving Diablo and then the energy crisis. And
Mm,
so the energy crisis, I mean, I vent occasionally on Twitter. You may see criticizing other journalists for not doing a very good job. But I should say, I do think that the guys at Bloomberg have done a really good job, a pretty good
yeah,
job. I think Bloomberg, like the difference, like Bloomberg is so far ahead of everybody else on energy that for me, it's like, I go read Bloomberg and then I read stuff in the New York Times and Washington Post and I just kind of go, it's just nowhere even close to it. Both sort of
Javier
the
Blas is really good. His coverage of
Javier is
on the
for sure.
electricity stuff is so good. I
Yeah.
mean, I read his stuff all the
Yeah.
time and I follow him on
Yeah.
Twitter. I just think he's amazing.
They have a bunch of good people there. I mean, they did a story the other day about how, Europe is buying up is bidding up the price of LNG and leaving Pakistan and other countries in trouble. They've been doing stuff on fertilizer shortages, and not just by Javier, but a broader team. So I think Bloomberg has done a pretty good job. The mainstream news media, I mean, they just basically have been swept up in the apocalyptic religion for the most part. I mean, even the Bloomberg guys they still have to talk about the energy transition by which they think we're going to move to solar panels and wind turbines.
Right.
But so on that stuff, I'm disappointed. Like I said, I'm actually making money for the first time on my Substack, and so I've which has been a real pleasure. I mean, it's not just the making money, but it's the kind of the independence, the being able to just really not have to. I mean, my nonprofit now is a small part of my income. It's about half my time. The Substack has really been the main event for me, Substack and speeches. So I'm super happy. I know that that's not the situation everybody can enjoy, but I do think even for people for whom Substack's not a huge source of income, at least it's another source of income that allows them to do some of that journalism and get properly paid for it for the first time in human history, if you think
Yeah.
about it.
No, Substack
So
is really interesting, and I've thought about doing that myself, but I don't know, just kind of inertia, and I kind of like writing for different outlets because it allows me to reach different audiences and so on. So how many subscribers do you have?
at this point I have 2,100 subscribers.
Uh huh. And how
I
many
have
paid
uh,
subscribers, and then unpaid? Is it what's the difference in the numbers there?
unpaid. I'll tell you the exact numbers: 33,600 all subscribers, 2,100 paid.
Uh huh. Oh, good
So
for you.
yeah, it's turned into yeah. I mean, my goal is if I can get 5 or 10,000 paid subscribers, then I could actually start doing some hiring more freelancers, actually building it out. It's a funny environment because I've talked to Roger Pilkey about trying to join forces a little bit. I've become closer friends with Leighton Woodhouse, who's also, as you know, on our WhatsApp group. And sometimes we talk about kind of joining forces, but then it's like, well, but you're making your own money, and so the incentives aren't really aligned at this point for people to join forces.
Right.
That may change if there's like a recession, for example, and people start cutting back on their Substack or subscriptions. I mean, I still get people that kind of go, hey, I subscribe to you, I subscribe to Leighton, I subscribe to Barry Weiss, like Glenn Greenwald, Matt Taibbi. I'm starting to spend a lot of money on Substack. How much
Right.
more money should I spend? And there's some people out there that just, are people with money and they want to spend money on this. There's other people that can't afford it. I've got into a thing where I paywall I give away the first third which is usually the debunking I do, and then I paywall the last 2/3.
Right.
So I love it. Yeah, I mean the state of journalism, it is what it is. I mean, to some extent it's driving the perception, to some extent it's just reflecting. I kind of go, is the nihilism coming from the news media? Is it coming from the public? Is it coming from scientists? Yes, is sort of the answer, all three.
Mm,
They all kind of work together. The advocates, the scientists, and the journalists kind of form that, or policymakers too. They kind of form the Bermuda Triangle of both positive information and misinformation out there.
right.
I mean, I gotta say, I mean, the stuff on the climate I still see is just bonkers. I mean, John Kirby, the Pentagon spokesperson, got up the other day and he said something about how natural disasters are getting worse. That's just factually wrong. Natural
Yeah.
disasters are not getting worse. Roger Pilkey posted a whole set of things today showing that natural disasters measured as the IPCC measures them, which is deaths and cost of disasters, are going down
Right.
because societies are becoming more resilient. So this declinism, this idea that the environment's getting worse rather than better, it's coming, I guess, on the one hand from journalists that want to sell newspapers. It's coming from scientists, but I do think it's just coming from something, deeply nihilistic in the culture that is projecting a kind of dystopianism onto the environment that isn't there. The environment. I'm about to publish a piece where I put up a picture of Pittsburgh 1940, Pittsburgh today. I mean, smoke in the streets in the 1940s.
Yeah.
It's a huge difference.
So it occurs to me as you're saying this, and we've skirted around it, but you talked about the hard times that you had. Where does the drive come from? Because you have a lot of drive, and I work hard, but you're a very prolific writer. It takes a certain kind of stones to run for governor, not just do it once, but do it twice. We talked last time about the fact that you quit drinking, you re-embraced your Christianity. What's the motive? What drives you? Because you clearly have a lot of it. What's behind that? What is it? How do you define that?
Well, maybe I might say, if I'm being honest, fear of death. I mean, when you're aware of your mortality, you can respond in a couple of ways. I mean, one way you can respond is to sort of try to deny it and just kind of go, well, I'll live on forever in heaven, or I don't want to think about it, is kind of another form of nihilism. Another approach is memento mori. It's remember your death, be aware of your death, because when you remind yourself of it, I can even feel it happening right now. Even when I just talk about it, it makes every interaction special. If life is short, then you better want to talk to Robert Bryce right now. You really better, if the clock is ticking,
do your best and get on with it.
Yeah, and be really clear and the choices. What I like about it is it adds gravity to the choices that you're making.
Yeah.
So it's not like, oh, I'll do I mean, by the way, I reached out to you, asked to do this because I wanted to celebrate Diablo Canyon with you. That was part of my motivation. You have to celebrate the victories when you get them.
Sure.
But yeah, I think it adds some intensity. Spend your time with people you like. Spend your time doing things that you're passionate about. Now, that doesn't mean that everything you do is easy. It actually often means quite the opposite. You're going to do things that are hard, but do things that after you do them, you have some satisfaction that you think if you look back in a finite life, you look back and be like, I'm glad I did that podcast with Robert Bryce. I'm glad I took the time after the Diablo Canyon victory to celebrate. I'm glad I rested over the weekend, and I'm glad I got back with it the following week. I just did 3 weeks. Helen and I did about a month in Martha's Vineyard on vacation, and I got some real deep relaxation. So, and I no regrets at all. I might regret the COVID I got on the way back home, but. I think
I've got it. Everybody's going to get it. Get over it. Yeah, so
I would say memento mori is a big part of it, brother. A big part of it is actually keeping in mind that you're mortal and that your choices matter, and you only live YOLO.
Yeah.
YOLO, no FOMO.
Talk to me about this. You use this line, narcissistic nihilism, in a recent Twitter post, and I thought you'd put something on Substack. But to me, what was remarkable, I think it was some Extinction Rebellion people, or that they had glued themselves to Botticelli, at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. It wasn't, they didn't attach themselves to the painting, but there was another one that I thought they actually had glued themselves to a painting or something.
Yeah.
And to me, it was, just truly shocking. And it's partly, I'm not in Europe, but the mindset of someone who would do that when Europe is in the middle of what is a total crisis. And they're saying, right, we shouldn't build any more LNG plants. Or, there was a demonstration in Germany just a few days ago about, we shouldn't, it was, we want the crisis to be worse. And it's so hard for me to identify with that kind of a mindset. And is that narcissist? I want to just explore that phrase. Is that your phrase, or is you borrowed from someone else? I'm not, amateurs borrow professional steel. Where did that phrase come from?
I actually, it's interesting. I haven't seen people combine them. I don't know that people have, or have not before. I mean, I think it's those three things. It's nihilism, it's narcissism, and it's neuroticism.
Mm.
So, I mean, I think what's interesting about that example is people are suffering and will die because of lack of energy. And so these activists are standing up there saying, we want more of that.
Yeah, exactly. That's it, exactly. And the fertilizer issue, which is, and I want to, maybe if we have time, we can talk about that as well, because this is the looming catastrophe. I mean, just truly,
Yeah.
I had a podcast this week with John Harpole, and we talked about it. I mean, and Jordan Peterson, Peter Zion, they're projecting famine. I mean, this is incredibly serious. And yet you have these, and I would say youngsters, I mean, they look to be 20 somethings attaching themselves to this painting because we're using too much energy. I mean, where are you from? Wait a minute. How bad is your life that you're advocating for death? I mean, this is just, because that's how I saw it.
Yeah. Right. So there is so you see, what are they doing? They're saying, pay attention to me. So that's the narcissism.
Because I'm suffering. Because
Yes,
right.
They are suffering. And often they're suffering because they're mediocre. I mean, those people that are gluing themselves to artworks are artists themselves. Do we think that those are great artists? Do we think that great artists are going out and gluing themselves? I don't think so. I think these are probably not very good artists. These are probably people, these are unhappy people, these are depressed people. They're seeking to give their lives meaning. That's the nihilism. Another aspect of the nihilism is that they're seeking to basically just undermine civilization. That's the anti-energy part of it. The neuroticism is this kind of idea that the world is coming to an end. It's a kind of fear-mongering, which, you make yourself scared so you can scare others. And that's what they're doing in that move. So I think the psychology is very, very interesting. I'm also very interested in, what does it say about a civilization that would seek to take instruction from a spoiled child, from a tyrannical, spoiled child? Remember, a tyrannical child, you said your father, you and I are both parents, you have a 5-year-old, and you say, honey, you can have peanut butter and jelly or mac and cheese. And your child says, in a spoiled moment, by the way, because all kids do this, I don't want either of those. The proper response as a parent is to say, okay, you don't have to eat mac and cheese or peanut butter and jelly. A coddling parent says, oh, what can I get you then? What can I make for you? No. The choices were peanut butter and jelly, mac and cheese. But the tyrannical child says, no, I don't want. So you say that Greta Thunberg says, we have to stop emissions. It's black or white. That's what she says in her TED Talk. People say, okay, great. Well, let's do more nuclear. Nope, it can't be nuclear. Okay, well, you're dealing with a tyrannical child. This is a child that's not interested actually in what she says she's interested in. What she's interested in is control. She's interested in exercising power over grown-ups.
And getting more attention.
And getting more attention for herself and remaining in control, remaining at the center of attention, throwing food around the kitchen and banging on the tray. Good parents ignore those behaviors. Good parents aren't, they don't beat their kids. It's hard to do, by the way. I've seen parents do it when their kids turn a temper tantrum, to let them throw a temper tantrum. It's hard to do in public, because it's so embarrassing. But it's actually it's a positive form of parenting. It kind of goes, I'm not going to react when you throw a temper tantrum. Well, Greta's parents were unwilling to do that with her. And so then she's released into the society and then imposes on the society. And then the society celebrates this petulant behavior. And it then says, we're actually going to take instructions from her. You're dealing with a child, you're dealing with a society, a decadent society that is reverting to an infantile state. That's what's going on in Europe. And that's what's going on with this desire to take instruction from Greta Thunberg. Or we have AOC, a similarly petulant child. They know nothing about energy. They're not interested in learning about it. So obviously reflects, people always say on Twitter to me, they go, I don't know why you're criticizing Greta. It's the adults who've elevated her. It's like, no, I get it. Absolutely. It's the people that empowered Greta. Greta's just an unhappy child experiencing a festival of narcissism. So, I mean, I think that speaks to where we're at. With Al Gore, we wanted the Old Testament preacher. With Greta Thunberg, we want the tyrannical spoiled child. And boy, this energy crisis, it's going to kill a lot of people, and that's terrible, but it's also going to have a positive impact, which is that it's going to wake us up back to reality. You know,
I hope I certainly
it needs to reality bites.
I certainly
So
hope you're right. And there are signs that that is happening. I don't know if you saw the headline that Liz Truss, who's the odds on favorite to succeed Boris as the prime minister in Britain, said if she becomes prime minister, she's going to end the fracking ban in Britain right away and start drilling. Well, they just don't have any other option. They have to start drilling. There's just no other. The U.S. LNG, yes, I agree with you. We can export a lot, but we can't supply the world's supply of gas. There are limits on the system. So that they're going to have to, and the other countries in Europe are going to have to end their fracking bans, and they're going to have to get some roughnecks and tool pushers and some drill rigs over there, and they have to get after it. And they need to start yesterday, but if you can't start yesterday, next best time is to start today.
Absolutely. I do think that's going to happen. I think we're going to see a return to power of the grown-ups.
And the energy rationalists, that we're going to have to face up to the mistakes that made over 20 years, right, of these fracking bans and overdependence on Russia, that they're going to, if they're going to have viable societies, they will have to produce more hydrocarbons, and they're going to have to go nuclear because they can't do it with just one. I don't think there are enough hydrocarbons. The nuclear, as I see it, is the only way to scale up electricity production that is going to make any sense. And so, but it's going to require grown-up attitude. Let's talk about Peter Zeihan for a minute, because I know I find him fascinating. I'm going to have him on the podcast in a couple of months. I've got his book. I've read parts of it, but I've listened to his podcast. Talking about Europe versus the U.S. and the rest of the world, to me, what's interesting about there are many things about his book. It's called The End of the World is Just the Beginning. But one of his conclusions is the U.S. is going to be the best house in a bad neighborhood, and which I find interesting. Sure. But it's because there are many factors, demographics, geography, but particularly energy. Have you read his book? He's particularly bearish on the demographics of China and some of the rest of particularly Western Europe. How do you see what his work is about? Because I find he's one of the most provocative intellectuals out there right now that I see. What's your view?
And it's a monster bestseller, by the way.
Yeah.
So I should say I love this book. I read it cover to cover. I learned a lot. I think the basic argument is wrong.
So
and that's okay.
Put a finger on that. What do you mean?
Well, it's like a Václav Smil book in that, like, I read a Václav Smil book and I get
we're screwed.
Well, yeah, I mean, I read a Václav Smil book and I get so much out of it, but the basic argument is Malthusian and wrong. Like, he's just stuck in Malthusianism. But Zion's not a Malthusian, but the argument and the whole book kind of pivots around it. So it's a really interesting, like, narrative device, but you can disagree with the main argument and still find the book absolutely wonderful to read. But the basic argument is that the end of the world is just beginning, because what he's referring to is the demographic collapse, particularly in China, but elsewhere in the world, where we're not producing enough new kids to be able to support the old people. And so you're going to have a significant decline of living standards. And the second thing that he assumes will happen without very good justification for it. And by the way, I met him and I interviewed him, and I think he's a great guy too. So this is just a strictly analytical disagreement, or I think it's a mistake. But he then says, well, the United States is going to stop being the policeman to the world. It's going to stop, policing shipping lanes for the oil trade. And so, countries are going to become balkanized. And I do think the world's reverting to nationalism, but I do think the United States has a lot of reasons to keep playing that role. Yeah. I mean, we've still got this incredibly sophisticated military. I think it needs to evolve. I'm going to argue in my next book on nuclear that the nuclear shield in particular needs to be split into 3 parts, so that Japan and Korea need their own weapons. Europe needs to provide its own nuclear shield. The United States can still play a role in global policemen, but I do think it's time for the nuclear shields to evolve. But I just think the United States, we've got this, there's just so much momentum behind having policing the world with our aircraft carriers and our shipping, and just watch the new Top Gun movie to feel inspired by it. But I mean, there's nothing that even remotely comes close to it. So I don't see that happening. And the LNG trade is been going like gangbusters. It is a deeply cyclical business, but nonetheless, I do think you're going to see a significant expansion of LNG trade and of pipelines. So So no, I mean, I think that I still think that we're in a period of significant material progress, and we're going to have much more material progress around the world. Demographic collapse, by the way, Americans developed the solution to that, which is that you import a bunch of, you accept a bunch of immigrants, and then you assimilate. And the biggest challenge is just assimilation. We're the best at it, though.
Yeah.
Europe struggles with assimilation. Asia struggles with it. The Japanese are, they're just not very welcoming of foreigners. But the solution is you import a bunch of people, who want to come to your country and work, and you let them become residents and then citizens, and their kids go to school and they marry locally and they intermix, and you create these wonderful, mixing, which I'm a big fan of. And that's the solution. And you don't have to have demographic collapse.
Yeah, well, I think that the demographic analysis I thought was provocative. I also liked, how and I think it was right. I have had Greg Easterbrook on the podcast to talk about his new book, which was really quite good. It's on the U.S. Navy, but I think my read of Zion is that his negative view of the U.S. Navy, or that it's not going to expand enough. I just don't see the U.S. Navy ceding that control of world sea lanes. That China is going to challenge in the South China Sea. That's what they're going to do. But I get that. But I just don't see the U.S. Navy saying, "Oh, sure, it's your backyard. You go ahead and control that." So what's next? Tell me about the new book, because and when is that? How far along are you? What's the pub date? What and the title? What's up with that?
So I'm working on two books. I'm really excited about both of them. The first
You're working
one is
so you published two books in the last 3 years, and now you're writing two more.
two books that will come out in the next 2 years.
You need to take a break, man. Here's the hammock.
I was in Martha's Vineyard, man. I had my break. No, I mean, the nuclear book. It's writing itself. I mean,
But you've done a lot of that work already, right? I mean, you've been writing this for a long time. I'm not saying it's easy, but you've been on this beat for many years now.
The nuclear book, it's a straightforward book. It's The War on Nuclear, Why It Hurts Us All. It'll come out in the fall of next year. And then the third book in the trilogy that I'm working on, I had said I wasn't going to say what the title was, but I actually feel comfortable now saying what it is. It's called Progressive Nihilism: Why Civilized People Undermine Civilization. And it'll be the third book in the trilogy that started with Apocalypse Never and went through SanFransicko. So Progressive Nihilism. And that book is going to argue that the greatest threat to civilization is coming from people struggling with purposelessness and the meaninglessness of the world. And this builds on Apocalypse Never, it builds on SanFransicko. It's going to look at a broader set of issues. I won't say all the issues because that's where it'll be really controversial, but a broader set of progressive issues where I think progressivism has become a religion, and that the religion is really destructive. Doesn't have to be, but is often the way it's manifesting quite destructive, undermining the institutions necessary for civilization. Electrical grids, policing, homeless shelters, psychiatric hospitals, education, meritocracy.
So you're calling it progressivism. I had another guest on the podcast, Batya Ungar Sargon, who's written a remarkably good book on called Bad News. Right? She calls it wokeism, and I think that's another. David French uses the same line about wokeism replacing Christianity, replacing traditional religion. That wokeism and this gender politics and all the and environment, or as in Jordan Peterson, his great podcast with Lex Friedman recently said, well, if it's about the environment is everything. You can't be about everything. If you're about everything, you're about nothing. And it was just kind of a devastating takedown of the whole business. But so that's going to be 4 books then that you'll publish in a span of 6 years, something like that. Is that is my math right?
Well, so Progressive Nihilism comes out in 2024. So I guess it'll be 4 books in 4 years. Yeah. No, is that right? Wow.
I don't know. Yeah. I'm not the one writing them. It took
SanFransicko was brutal. I mean, I'm not going to do that again. That was a response to COVID. I was grounded by COVID, and there was really, I just needed something to really sink my teeth into, but it was too aggressive.
Right. So let's step back. There were just a couple other things. My guest, you all, I'm sure you know Michael Shellenberger. He's been on the podcast twice before. He's the author of San Francisco: Why Progressives Ruin Cities, Apocalypse Never, which came out 2020. Is that right? Over 2 years ago.
Yeah.
And you can find him on Substack, substack.michaelschellenberger.com. Is that, do I have that right?
Yep. Yeah.
You were on Fox News just a day or two ago talking about energy policy, and you talked about China. The UN this week released a new report on Xinjiang. This supply chain issue is really one that's really, I mean, it's scary to me because of the lack of recognition, particularly among the climate activists who are promoting solar, with no discussion about, well, wait a minute, where are you getting your polysilicon? And the State Department just last year, State Commerce, Labor issued this remarkable report calling what's happening in Xinjiang genocide. So you were the first, I think, to call them Chinese solar genocide solar panels. Where are we today on this? And is the solar sector, climate activists going to acknowledge this? Are they purposely ignoring it? Because to me, it's a very problematic issue, and it's not going to be resolved anytime soon. How do you see it?
It makes me sad and angry, not just that it's happening, but that the progressives, and I have to say, I'm just appalled that I hesitate about whether to say their names. People that I have worked with in the past have not denounced these solar panels. I think this is a pretty cut and dry issue. You should not be importing these solar panels. I mean, the idea that this is even a conversation, I find it very disturbing that we know how these solar panels are being made in China, and there's people that still are lobbying for them to be imported, and that's considered okay. I find it almost chilling that this is happening. The evidence of the conditions they're being made under are just unbelievable. You know, people kind of point out things. They go, well, in the Congo, kids are mining cobalt. You know, I've been to the Congo, and it is brutal, but I do think there's something qualitatively different about a state rounding up a whole group of people, putting them in concentration camps, and then having them build solar panels, than a place like the Congo, which has been a broken government. And frankly, those kids are working for money. You know, Those are kids that are working on the farm that are now working in the mines. I'm not saying it's great, but I think it's not the same. Genocide is serious business. So what can I say?
And the State Department, I mean, I've written about it several times. I wrote about it in Newsweek a few weeks ago. I mean, it just is the fact that you have 6 big federal agencies all putting their names on a report calling out genocide in Xinjiang, and then in the same report saying 45% of solar grade polysilicon comes from Xinjiang. I mean, I don't recall anything in my recent experience that connects the dots so clearly on a major part of the energy sector. I can only imagine what if the oil and gas industry were involved in something like this, or the coal sector. I mean, it would be a whole different issue, but the solar sector doesn't want to talk about it. And then the Biden administration just didn't, when was it in June or July, said, oh, never mind on these tariffs and on these import restrictions. I mean, to me, it's just, I have solar panels on the roof of my house. Do I know that there's no slave labor in the poly? No, I don't. I mean, it's disturbing, but the lack of recognition of the issue to me is equally disturbing.
Yeah. It's very disturbing. I mean, I've had people say things like, well, you have an iPhone, and it's like, yeah, actually the iPhones are not being made in Xinjiang, this is very specific to solar. So no, I think it's a stain on the climate community. I think it's a stain on the left. In particular, the Democrats have been terrible on this. There were some who were good, but mostly Republicans have been the ones that have been leading on. So I find it shocking and disturbing, and I'd like to find a way to do more about it. I'm not sure what else I can do because I've also written a fair amount about it. I'm not sure what else I can add to it, but I'm chilled by it. I'm disturbed by it. I'm definitely going to be putting it in the nihilism book.
But it's weird as you're saying this, because I'm hearing you say that and I'm thinking, oh, he's like the Jeremiah, right? He's the moralist around these issues. And yet I think, well, wait, goddamn minute here. What is this? It's not old fashioned to say genocide is bad. It's just, but to even have the conversation is pretty remarkable that the solar sector doesn't want to talk about it. It doesn't, the New York Times reported on the UN report, but there was nothing about the solar sector, right? Nothing connecting the dots, which is, I mean, that's okay for, this is what a large part of what I do, try and connect the dots. What's the context here? But anyway, that's maybe a longer discussion. So we've been talking for more than an hour. I don't want to keep you much longer, Michael. So I always ask my guests a couple of questions. So what are you reading now? I know you're writing 2 books, but you read a lot. You're a voracious reader and a prolific writer. Any books we talked about Peter Zion, any other books that are catching your attention now? If so, what?
Definitely Zion, Superabundance. I went and reread all the Nietzsche on nihilism. It's absolutely incredible. I really loved it. Hard to recommend it to people because I don't think people would it's not just stuff that people would get a lot of pleasure from, but for me, it's super fascinating. Why do we feel guilty about things that we didn't do, and we don't take responsibility for the things that we did do? Yeah, and like I said, I'm really enjoying Bloomberg. I'm enjoying their news coverage of the crisis. But I'm always looking for good books, man. You tell me, what are you reading right now, Robert?
Well, Easterbrook's book, I wish I had it on my at hand. It's the Blue Water Navy. Well, you've read Meredith Angwin's book, Shorting the Grid?
Sure, of course. Yeah.
This is a book that I'm kind of pissed off about, honestly. I've contacted John Doerr several times and the people at Climate Imperative. I want him to come on and talk about his book. They won't reply to my emails. I did just buy this. In fact, when I was in New Mexico, I bought the American Prometheus, the biography of Robert Oppenheimer, which I'm interested in reading. Have you read that one?
Fantastic. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, so that's one that's at the top of my list, and unfortunately, you can see it's not even dented because I've been been reading too much. Well, and I do have my my bird guide. I always have the bird field guide to the birds at hand. So that's. Last question then, Michael. We've talked about a lot of things, some of which are depressing, some of which are uplifting. What gives you hope now?
I tell you, I get a lot of hope out of the pro-nuclear leaders. The people we mentioned, Mark Nelson, Maddie Serwinski, Paris Wine, Zion Lights. They are out there doing things that are inspiring to me. Maddie had a tweet thread on nuclear waste that went like mega viral the other week. She did a thing on nuclear accidents that put up these incredible photos of wildlife in Chernobyl. I'm totally inspired by her. I'm inspired by Mark and the Stand Up for Nuclear events. The pro-nuclear movement, for me, is really inspiring. I love what's happening to the media. I worry that the social media companies are allowing themselves to be bullied by the federal government. I have been censored myself by Facebook, and it still pisses me off, and I have to find a way to get at and address it. But I mostly think that what's going on with Substack and Twitter is really positive because it creates this new challenge to conventional media.
Yeah.
It gets a way for those of us that are independent journalists to challenge those guys. I mean, I can beat up. It used to be that you'd be scared to criticize the Washington Post because you wanted to be quoted by them at some point. Not anymore. Now you can beat up on those guys, and I don't care at all. And those are big organizations. There's a lot of different people there. So for me, it's nice. I'm really happy to, on the one hand, getting some invitations to talk into those publications again in a ways that I haven't had for a few years, but also not feeling the need anymore. Being able to have the independence to be able to say what I think is right and not be worried about what other people will think or, whether it fits into the Overton window or not. I just think it really changes even the Overton window itself. What's considered acceptable discourse, I think, has gotten a lot broader in many ways. I think in some ways people have gotten narrower, and that's the trend that we worry about, people wanting to reinforce their prior views in their media bubbles. But I also think that things like Twitter and Substack open people up to voices that they don't normally hear.
I tend to agree with you. I think it's made the river, I'm mixing my metaphor, made the river wider, right? Before, there were only a few channels that were where you had discourse at all. And now there are a lot more channels and there are a lot more people can navigate across those. So it's that's ability to select has been broadened significantly. So yeah, I tend to agree. But Michael, it's been great to talk to you. Great to catch up.
You too, Robert.
Congratulations on
man.
your success with Substack, and attaboy for. I can't imagine running for political office. The fact that you did, good on you. We need leadership, and we need people who are dedicated to it. And I think it's great that you did it.
Appreciate you, brother. Always a pleasure to be with you. Can't wait to see you next time in Austin, man.
Yeah. And so that's the end of this Power Hungry podcast. To all you in podcast land, until next time, see you.